Welcome everyone to the Stevenson Center. We're glad that you're here. This is wonderful. What a great turnout we've got for this particular program. It's my job to introduce our speaker, so I will go ahead with that. Edwin Yohnka was appointed Director of Communications and Public Policy for the American Civil Liberties Union of Illinois in 1999. And he's the primary spokesman for the Civil Rights and Civil Liberties Advocacy Organization, which has over 35,000 members and supporters. He appears regularly on the ACL's behalf on television and radio programs in Illinois and throughout the nation to speak on legislative and legal issues related to the ACLU of Illinois, and contributes and coordinates efforts to communicate through media, in-house publications, and online resources. Yohnka served as the vice chair for the Illinois Unites for Marriage, a diverse coalition of organizations that help pass and ensure the freedom to marry for all couples in Illinois. Previous to his ACL position, Yohnka served on the staff of the American Bar Association as a special presidential assistant in the ABA's Office of the President. There, he directed and oversaw the development and the implementation of communication vehicles for the elected leadership. Today, we'll hear from Mr. Yohnka about the Trump administration attack on sanctuary cities and our own Chicago's welcoming city ordinance, its implications for our immigrant communities. We welcome Mr. Yohnka to the Stevenson Center and look forward to an informative presentation and discussion. Thank you very much. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you, Pat, for that generous introduction and for the chance to be here this afternoon. You know, you heard that I have been with the ACLU since 1999. So I've done a lot of these kinds of events over the years. Maybe not quite in as lovely a setting as this quite regularly, to be candid, but I've done a lot of these events. But one of the things is when you hear that introduction, you know, you're always reminded of the old line about, you know, that's an introduction that my father wouldn't recognize and my mother would appreciate. And you do learn, of course, over time, never ever, when you get a great introduction, to correct the person who's introducing you. In no way should you ever correct them. But I'm going to break that rule today. For one reason, is that, and it makes me appreciate the fact I need to update my bio. So let me let you in on a little secret. The 35,000 number of members and supporters for the ACLU actually is an old number that came out of our high point in the post 9/11 era. And so, as you probably guess, as people's concerns ebb and flow about civil liberties, our membership ebbs and flows. So by last November 8th, when I left the office, expecting a little bit of a different result than we saw that evening, our membership had actually fallen to about 14,000 people across the state of Illinois. Today, the number is 72,000 people. And I would like to suggest that it's because I'm out speaking more. And I'm sure by the end of this hour, many of you will think, oh, no, it is Donald Trump. And it is. There are many areas in which that's true, but certainly some of what we're going to talk about today. I also want to thank Nancy Stevenson for helping to put this together, and for all of you for turning out here today, and for giving me a chance to come and talk about the so-called sanctuary cities and what they are, and this attack on the notion of a sanctuary city by the Trump and Sessions Justice Department, and how that impacts communities across the country, and maybe speculate a little bit about what we might see as we go forward. Now, it is true that kind of talking about sanctuary cities and talking about these areas clearly invokes the general discussion that we're having today about our nation's immigration policies. And as I was getting ready to come here today, I couldn't help but think about those policies and this debate, especially in the context of the season that we're in, that we are about to have Thanksgiving. And I suppose that for many of us, or if not most of us, at least those of us who aren't concerned with travel plans or cooking for relatives that your wife arranged to come to your house, it's my sister too, which is the strange thing, or having to deal with relatives who we disagree with politically. I'm off the hook this year, it's not my brother. I think it is a time of the year when we really do have that moment of thinking about gathering with our friends and family and really, keeping in mind those things about which we're most thankful for. And inevitably, at those kinds of gatherings, many of our thoughts and even some of our conversations at dinner tables turn to this kind of fundamental notion of our own uniquely American origin story for our family. It's a tale that for many of us is about people who came to this country from some other place, from some other home, to seek a better life and a family fortune. And for most of us, I think, we revere, we esteem, we are grateful for those brave souls because for all of the hardships and for all of the challenges that they went through, for many of us or most of us, it has been worth it and it has been rewarding. Because if we're honest, I think, most of us have prospered as part of this story. We have raised our own social status. We've gotten a good education, and we live a relatively comfortable life. We had dinner last night with a friend of mine from college that we figured out, I have now known for 40 years and a few months. And in the course of the conversation, as he oftentimes does, as I recount something that I like to do or something that I particularly enjoy, he will say to me, yeah, I was raised poor. And this was somebody who, I think both of us grew up in middle class circumstances, but by the end of the night, as we were laughing about coming out here, my college friend is trying to convince me to go on a trip with him to Florence, Italy, to get custom-made shoes. Neither of our parents could have ever imagined seriously having such a conversation. But it is, I think the nature of how these stories evolve from generation to generation and the good fortune that's visited upon us because of people who've taken the chance and taken the opportunity to come to this country. Today, I think, sadly, that story appears to be held not in esteem in many ways, but in a way of disregard, where newcomers to our nation are treated more as political punching bags. And we hear the kinds of labels that are attached to them, criminals and rapists and murderers. And the presumption is that anybody who's coming to this country is only coming to take and not really to give or invest or to contribute to our society. And of course, these things ignore the real data about people who come to this country, how quickly people assimilate into the society, how quickly people learn English, how quickly people are contributing at all levels of our society, and the economic engine that is immigration. But the debate over immigration today is not so much about a policy discussion or facts or figures. It really has become, I think, sadly, kind of a blood sport, with efforts at every turn to kind of limit and curtail immigration and to make calls for increased enforcement, which are both unrealistic and unnecessary. And that whole trend of the last few years now literally has a physical component to it. A physical component, because we've now seen that we've gone so far that the way we are going to answer any concerns that we have with immigration is, of course, to build a physical wall and to literally shut ourselves out from the rest of the world and keep people out of our country. And that obviously became a refrain and even a chant among others in the last presidential election. A wall. And the debate itself then has really become so toxic and so visceral that it's difficult to focus on these facts and the actual data and the actual letter of federal law around immigration. And it appears that these things no longer matter in any of this conversation. And I think that's really the most sad thing of all. And all of these things combine in many ways around this issue of so-called sanctuary cities. And so I am happy to have the opportunity to come and to talk about these today and to sort of see how all of these strands, I think, of these issues kind of come together in this. So let me be clear as I start. There is literally no such thing as a sanctuary city. It does not exist. It is a figment of political dialogue and, I suspect, focus groups and testing. It is a made-up term that is intended to sound like a place where newcomers, where people who are undocumented can move freely around without any fear of encountering any sort of immigration enforcement. No such city actually exists. No such jurisdiction is really free in that way. And that includes, by the way, San Francisco and Berkeley and Cambridge and, yes, even Chicago. ICE agents, the immigration enforcement agents of today, are not barred from acting in any community across the country. They are not stopped from engaging in their activities, and they are not, through any statute or through any law, kept from enforcing immigration laws with the appropriate authority. So this notion, again, that this exists is just something that isn't really true. So at its core, the debate over this sort of made-up phrase is actually about how state and local law enforcement agencies and authorities interact with federal law enforcement agencies, and specifically these days, how they interact and intersect with them over the issues of detainers. And for all that you'll hear about this, these detainers often are really at the core of especially the way the Trump and Sessions administration is pushing back against local authorities in terms of their activities around this. So to talk about this, let's get a little bit of definition, and we should put a little bit of facts behind these discussions. An immigration detainer, or what is often referred to by people as an ICE hold, is a request from ICE, the federal authority charged with immigration enforcement, to a state or local law enforcement agency, court, or jurisdiction. The request in question is one in which the state or local authority is asked to hold an individual who is identified in the hold or in the request until that person can be taken into immigration custody. Now, most typically, although not 100% of the time, the detainer asks the state or local jurisdiction to hold the person for 48 hours. And by the way, they ask them to hold them for 48 hours at the state or local agency's expense beyond the time that that person would otherwise be released. And when you think about this, most often, and the most common thing that we saw for years and we see now around the country is that people are released because you would not hold someone or detain someone for a small charge, for example, of driving without an appropriate driver's license. Sometimes it can be because the charges against the person were not sustained and they were dropped after they were arrested or brought into custody. Or the person was released on bail or their own recognizance because they were no longer a threat to anyone, or a judge deemed them to be appropriate for such release. Or the person was acquitted of a crime, or they had completed a jail or a prison sentence. And there's an important thing here in the language that I've used, which I want to underscore, which is when I say that these are requests from ICE, they are just that. Even ICE acknowledges that no detainer request is mandatory. In fact, this is really critically important to conceive from a legal perspective, because a detention that results from an immigration detainer request actually constitutes a new arrest or detention of the person. They have completed whatever the detention was in the previous circumstance, whether they were just being held, whether they had been released on bail or recognizance, or they had been given, or they had finished or completed a sentence. So this is this is a new event. If you think about it again in the context of, as I said, the typical example where someone would be detained having been stopped for driving without an appropriate license. The police and local judge figures out that's not someone who should be held any longer. That ends that consideration. This is a brand new detention for them to be held for these additional 48 hours. And so because of this, courts have found in the past that the Fourth Amendment rights of the person who's detained are violated when the detention happens without a judicial warrant or without individualized determination of probable cause. So without a judge saying that this is the person you should have to hold, and that someone has made an individualized determination that that person poses a risk which is sufficient to cause them to be held. And again, or a judge has to determine that the person has committed some other crime or is subject to removal. And again, the key is here that it's something which is done by a judge and is done in a fashion in which the judge issues a warrant for that person to be held. Now, under the Trump administration, ICE has issued a new detainer policy. They did it back in April of this year, that requires ICE officials who are seeking a detainer to attach one of two forms. I will not bore you, I promise you, with the numbers or get into the weeds on these forms, but they have to, even they acknowledge that you have to attach one of these two forms to a detainer request when it goes to state or local officials. But they acknowledge, and have acknowledged both in court and in congressional hearings, that these forms are not judicial warrants, that they do not supply any additional authority to honor the detainer request than ICE simply calling up and making it. There is no additional individualized suspicion, and there's nothing about it which permits the person to be held beyond the time that the state or local officials have already determined. Now, this is really important from a state or local official perspective, and it's important for a couple of reasons. Even the new forms, and this is the other element of this, even these new forms that ICE has asserted have to be attached to the request are federal forms that can only be executed by federal officials. They in no way absolve a local jurisdiction or arresting official or officers from any liability under the Fourth Amendment. And this creates a real problem for state and local officials. According to the records of ICE, if you just look at 4 years in a past administration, so from fiscal year, or past two actually, from fiscal year 2008 through fiscal year 2012, the federal government erroneously issued more than 800 detainer requests that weren't for immigrants, they were actually for United States citizens. And, you know, obviously, I think in the most obvious thing I'll say today, these are not people who are eligible for deportation. These are people who are American citizens. And most of these false or in error requests were made as the result of mainly misidentification or similarity of names. And that became the trigger for an American citizen to then be held and withheld, you know, hundreds and hundreds of times over the course of a few years. As a side note, it won't surprise you to learn that many of those American citizens have sued the state and local government who held them and have subjected those local jurisdictions to enormous financial liability as the result of, you know, those illegal detentions, which the courts have again and again looked at as being a secondary event and a secondary detention from their original stop. And so, you know, one of the things that I think when we look at this effort by the Trump and Sessions administration to press state and local governments to honor more detainers and for them to issue more detainers is that it does put state and local government in the place where they are going to be open to far more of these kinds of errors, and as a result, far more of these kinds of lawsuits. And so, you know, this is why, just as one example, groups like the ACLU and other immigrant rights groups that we work with have always advised state and local government officials that they should decline to honor any ICE detainer request absent a judicial warrant, simply in order to minimize the risk of holding a person in violation of the Fourth Amendment and opening themselves up to these kinds of lawsuits, as well as scrutiny for those actions, because when you hold an American citizen in that, it inevitably becomes a news story that is terribly embarrassing, not just to ICE, but to the state and local officials who participate in them. And so these detainers are really at the heart of this interaction and this intersection between ICE officials and state and local government that really come around to this idea of someone being, or an area being some sort of a sanctuary. Because what happens is that state and local governments looking at this often take a series of steps or pick from a menu of steps that limit their involvement with state and local, or that limit their involvement on the state and local level with the immigration enforcement officials. And they do this in a number of ways. For example, a state or local government might well limit simply the circumstances under which they would honor one of these detainers, and most likely and most regularly, these policies prohibit local authorities from honoring ICE detainer requests without a judicial warrant. And I would just stop here for a moment and note that this policy of not recognizing ICE detainers without a judicial warrant is now the policy of the state of Illinois as the result of the Illinois Trust Act that was passed and signed into law this last legislative session. And the reason I'm stopping and doing this extemporaneously is that's going to become important later, not when I worked on this earlier in the week because of some developments. But it's important to note that that's a step that has been taken not just simply by individual law enforcement agencies in Illinois, but by the entire state of Illinois. In addition to that, a state or local government might place specific defined limitations on the use of local government resources or personnel for federal immigration enforcement. These policies could limit or prohibit local government employees from sharing information with immigration officials, such as the address of an individual, their employer, their school and where they're attending school, a court date that they have coming up, their custodial status, the date that they will be released from jail or from prison. And again, this information is denied only in those cases, in these kinds of situations, where there isn't a judicial warrant. So again, if ICE has a specific warrant about a specific individual, they're able to garner this information, but they're not allowed to have access to it just by simply calling up and saying, tell me all the people that you have coming up who have a court date. And these policies might also well limit or prohibit immigration officials from accessing or being able to interview a person who is in jail or in prison. And again, I add the caveat, unless there is a specific warrant that attaches to that individual person. So in some communities around the country, what we've seen is ICE officials simply kind of setting up shop at a prison or a jail and just going through and beginning to question all of the people who are detained there about their immigration status, and then using that information from those interviews to try to pursue deportation actions against those individuals. And finally, a state or local government might be prohibited by law or by local ordinance from entering into cooperative agreements with immigration authorities that actually have state and local law enforcement agents ask questions and actually compel them to be part of federal immigration authorities. These are, for those of you who've watched this work for years, are generally known as 287G agreements between the federal government and state and local law enforcement agencies. But these are really kind of formalized agreements that create cooperation and information sharing and really involve these state and local law enforcement agents into the work of ICE and into the work of that federal government enforcement. And you sometimes see this, especially in the context of ICE being in a community and conducting a raid, and state or local officials are there as part of the raid, creating in part an environment for people in which they believe that these are the police and they have to cooperate fully and they're at risk of being arrested, and et cetera. And it just creates a different kind of relationship for people in these contexts than often would otherwise. Now, other policies might limit state or local government employees of all stripes from inquiring into someone's immigration status unless, of course, that status was important for establishing their eligibility for benefits or being able to access other kinds of state or local laws. Now, there are really good reasons why state or local governments adopt these policies. In just this last instance, where someone is prohibited from inquiring for a state or local police officer, you can imagine why it's important not to ask these questions just in the context of conducting a criminal investigation, or interviewing the victim of a crime, or trying to get information about some criminal activity. Because state and local law enforcement entanglement in federal immigration can invite a whole range of problems. We know for a fact, when we look at states, at jurisdictions where 287G agreements have been in place, that it changes the mindset of state and local law enforcement agencies that can invite a kind of racial profiling, whether that's intended or not. It just creates the atmosphere where that happens. And obviously, this not only diverts precious resources from the work that state and local law enforcement officials have to do, it violates the Constitution's core promises of equal protection under the law to all and freedom from unreasonable search and seizure. I think there's kind of no better example of this than I would like to say the recently convicted Joe Arpaio, but I have to say, I guess, the recently pardoned Joe Arpaio, who literally turned his sheriff's department into an immigration force. And in trial and hearing after trial and hearing was discovered to have stopped thousands of American citizens for simply the purpose of immigration enforcement in violation of the Constitution. And of course, when that was revealed, and when he was found guilty of that activity, he simply refused to stop. And when a federal court finally found him in contempt, I suppose he had the good luck of having a president who thought that that was a good idea and ended up being pardoned. But this is exactly the kind of thing on a much smaller scale that we see in other jurisdictions around the country, even inland from border areas. Once these kinds of formalized agreements are in place for state and local law enforcement officials to engage in immigration enforcement. But this entanglement that I've talked about, also can harm public safety. I think if you ask any police officer, any police official to be sure, and really most community members, what we know is communities are safest when the police and the community trust one another and work together. And that trust is undermined when the police who are there to keep a community safe are then viewed as forces as part of a large federal effort around detention and deportation. When these state and local officials are actually viewed as being part of that process, then immigrant communities have a much less trusting view and therefore refuse to participate with them. Immigrant witnesses and victims are less likely to report crimes or provide helpful intelligence, whether or not they themselves have legal status, but for fear of what that will do to their family members, to members of the community or others, and whether that will result in these individuals being questioned, detained, or even deported. The Major Cities Chiefs Association, the Presidential Task Force on 21st Century Policing, and the Attorney Generals from states like New York and Oregon, California, Washington, Rhode Island, and the District of Columbia have all adopted positions or policies opposing local law enforcement entanglement with federal immigration authorities on the grounds that it harms public safety. But since the inauguration of Donald Trump, who has consistently and openly called for mass deportation, with local law enforcement being the engine of that deportation, we see this effort to engage local law enforcement, notwithstanding all of the things that I've said are wrong with it, we've seen that as continuing to be a main goal of the Sessions Department of Justice. And it's causing real harm. We've seen at least two major, I should stop. It causes real harm not actually in what they're doing or the policies, where policies are being carried out, but the repeated calls for changes in this policy actually ends up having a detrimental impact on cities and communities across the country. So at least two major city police departments have seen a pronounced decrease in the reporting of serious crimes by Latinos. The Houston Police Department found that sexual assault incidents reported by Latinos in 2017 were down nearly 43% when compared to the same period in 2016. And the study also reported that at least a 12% decrease in the number of Latino reported aggravated assaults and robberies. The LA Police Department reported a 25% drop in reports of sexual assaults from Latino residents over the same time period in 2016, and a 10% drop in reports of domestic violence from Latino residents in 2017 over the same period of time in Chicago. And while we don't have specific data about these for the city of Chicago and for the Chicago Police Department, and even if we did, who knows if the Chicago Police Department would ever make that data public. One of the things that we are seeing is that we know from data from the Office of Emergency Management and Communications is that, for example, in the police district in Chicago that covers Chinatown, calls to police, calls to 911 are down by 33% this year over last year. And so people are experiencing crime and experiencing things like domestic violence and sexual assault and physical attacks, and simply not viewing the police as being people who can help. And this is in cities, Houston, LA, Chicago, other places like this, where none of their policies with regards to this have changed. But what has happened is this constant drumbeat of information from the White House and from the Department of Justice is already changing behavior on the ground. You know, there's one more thing I should probably say before talking a little bit about where we are right now in some of this. And that is that federal immigration law is really among the most complex bodies of law in the United States for a variety of different reasons. For some years after I left, as Pat indicated, after I left working with the American Bar Association, I served on the ABA's Commission on Immigration, including being the vice chair for a few years. And I was always amazed that if you put a question about a matter of immigration law to this commission, which was made up of 12 members, most of whom were immigration law professors of some note, as I always joked, of the 12 people in the room, we could usually get about 14 or 15 different opinions on what the law was. It is a complex area of law. And the training that really would be required for a state or local law enforcement officer at the street level to fully understand what that law is and how to enforce it would be extremely costly and would take away from the time that those officers really need to do the work, the difficult work that we ask them to do in terms of keeping our neighborhoods and blocks and our communities safe. And that is, for me, I will just say that is kind of the ultimate reason not to engage state and local law enforcement agents in this federal work, and it's why most of them have not. And in response to this resistance by most state and local agencies to become involved in federal immigration enforcement, and this will be shocking to many of you, the Trump administration has responded with bullying and threats. It's really kind of out of character for them as usual, but that has been what they've done, and specifically what they've tried to do is threaten to cut off federal funding to state and local law enforcement agencies. Some of that funding, obviously, we know is incredibly critical to those agencies if, in fact, they don't engage in immigration enforcement. So back in January of 2017, a mere week after his inauguration, the president issued a number of executive orders around immigration. The most noteworthy, obviously, was the so-called Muslim ban, which created the great chaos overnight and the next day. But one of them was an executive order on interior enforcement. And in that particular executive order, the Trump administration promised to cut federal funding from jurisdictions which it deemed to be sanctuaries. And probably for many of the reasons we've talked about today, they didn't actually define what a sanctuary community was. And because it was not clear in the text of the executive order, a federal court, in this case in San Francisco, was pretty quick to block that threat nationwide as being overly broad and too vague. In August, they tried again, this time through the Department of Justice, by announcing two conditions in order for state or local agencies to keep specific federal law enforcement grants, what's called the Burn JAG program. And under the new conditions announced by the Department of Justice, the grantees, that is the state and local law enforcement agencies, would have to agree to a number of conditions, but two that, as I say, that were new and really important. The first is that they would have to allow federal immigration authorities to enter jails in order to interrogate inmates. And they would have to provide ICE 48 hours notice before releasing any person if ICE requested it. The legality of these conditions is being litigated in a number of courts around the country, most noteworthy here in Chicago, where the city of Chicago brought a lawsuit against the Department of Justice and ICE for these new provisions. And in the Chicago lawsuit, one of the things that the city argued was that the Constitution assigns the federal spending power to Congress alone, and that agencies, including the Department of Justice, could not simply impose new conditions on federal funding that Congress never authorized in order to achieve a particular policy goal. In other words, that the DOJ did not have free rein to simply invent new conditions out of thin air. And of course, a federal court has barred the Department of Justice from blocking those grants on these conditions for precisely these reasons. And in fact, most recently, the Department of Justice went back to the federal court and said, we interpret the federal law to say that these things were supposed to be included in the first place. And the federal court has just simply rejected that and left this injunction in place. A federal court in Philadelphia has done the exact same thing this week and simply noted that the federal law never conceived of the notion that state and local law enforcement agencies were intended under any circumstances to receive these funds to allow access to their jails for immigration enforcement, or to turn over people or their names without a court order. But since August, and since the blocking of some of this, the DOJ has turned to another tactic. And we have seen, including this week, 2 rounds of letters to state and local jurisdictions that the Department of Justice says is out of compliance with this federal law and threatening to cut off funding for these burn JAG grants unless the agency changes some particular law. And this week, in this second round of letters, one of the letters actually went to the entire state of Illinois, to the state government, claiming that the Illinois Trust Act, which again demands that in order for federal officials to get or to have a detainer honored, it needs to come with a specific judicial warrant. That the claim is that that specific provision of the Illinois Trust Act is violative of federal law, and that the entire state would put at risk this money in order to, if they did not, or if they do not rescind that law or refuse to enforce it. And I will just say that I think these letters, with their threats, are really an attempt to target cities across the state or across the country that may be considering new activities or new measures to limit their entanglement with federal immigration authorities. And it has an effect. I was in Springfield recently and heard this incredible story about a group of advocates in Springfield who had come together in order to pass simply a welcoming city resolution, not an ordinance with the power of law, but just a resolution that said that the city of Springfield welcomes immigrants, newcomers, and asylum seekers into their city. And speaker after speaker in opposition got up and would include in their presentations the idea that Springfield would risk losing federal funding for everything Springfield gets federal funding for, not just this, were they to take this action. And the council ended up tabling a resolution on the basis that it could impact their capacity to get federal funds. And so I think that this really demonstrates that these efforts by Trump and Sessions are having their impact, which is, to strong arm as many jurisdictions as possible, either into colluding with the federal government, if you'll pardon the word colluding in this context, or simply to block jurisdictions from taking, the kinds of steps that they think are reasonable in their communities in order to keep people safe. And all of this matters because you cannot escape the backdrop of this, which is that one of the other executive orders that the president has signed and that the DOJ and DHS are enforcing actually does something which is almost unheard of in the history of immigration enforcement in the United States and certainly in modern times. Depending on who you talk to, there are 8 million or 11 million, or the president likes to say maybe up to 20 million people who are in this country in an undocumented status. There is no way that we can reasonably, as a country, detain and deport all of those people today. It would create an economic upheaval that we couldn't withstand. We simply don't have the resources in order to do it. We would have to put enormous federal resources simply into the kind of detention that would be involved. And so administrations from over the last several decades have created priorities. And the priorities really don't, frankly, look much different from administration to administration. They tend to be that people who are convicted or suspected or involved in serious criminal activities are the people who are at the highest priority of being detained and deported. And that where there are circumstances, as there are in countless cases across the country today, that people are living in blended families, where someone, perhaps the parents, one is documented and one is not, and of the children, maybe some children are not documented and others are actually American citizens, that oftentimes the government has taken the position that they shouldn't be in the business of breaking up those families in terms of that, which is set another one of the priorities. The Trump administration has simply eliminated all the priorities. If you are eligible for deportation, you are now a priority. And of course, when you don't have any priorities, we know what happens as the result. That people who have been living here, without incident, without being involved in criminal activity, who have contributed to their society, who have raised families and participated in our economy, these are the people who are being targeted for deportation. Some of you may have seen a few months ago, shortly after the president took office, when 60 Minutes went to a small town and interviewed people, all of whom had supported President Trump. But they couldn't figure out, why it was that they thought they were going to get the bad hombres, and why is it they were deporting the guy who owned the local restaurant that they all loved. What did they think was going to happen? There was a part of me, I will admit, my wife is here today, as she knows I only scream at the television during Cubs playoff games and 60 Minutes. And, but you did want to sort of say, what did you think that was going to happen when you eliminated all of these priorities? Who did you think you were going to be able to find? When you said to Customs and Border Patrol and ICE, I am taking the shackles off, who were they going to go after? Were they going to go after criminals who know how to hide and that? Or are they going to go after people who'd been checking in with ICE regularly for the past 20 years? It is no secret what happened here. And that's why the question of how state and local officials intersect and interact with these enforcement agents with this priority-less system really matters. And it really is important. I want to, just before I close, I just want to say one other thing which is really important in this debate. And you hear it constantly, and the Attorney General said it just this week. He said that the communities who continue to adopt these programs where they don't participate actively with federal immigration enforcement agencies are choosing to protect undocumented people in the United States over the safety and security of American citizens. There are nicer ways to say this, but that is a lie. It is malicious. It is poisonous and it is toxic. Because the first thing is it suggests that people who are newcomers and immigrants are somehow inherently dangerous. And there is no statistical evidence that a person, even who is undocumented, is more likely to commit a crime, is more likely to commit a violent crime, or is more likely to create problems in our communities than someone who was born and raised in the United States. That simply is not true. But it is intended to create this suspicion in people's minds that somehow all of our crime problems, all of our issues, all of our things could be fixed if we only did this. And you know, we have seen it from this administration time and time and time again. There are many topics on which I fear that the President of the United States currently does not really understand the details of the policy that he talks about. But the one that just sends me is when he talks about crime in Chicago. And recently, again, the president has suggested that the crime in Chicago is linked to the fact that it is a sanctuary city, in his words. The crime in Chicago has many, many, many reasons, which I would be happy sometime to come back and speak to. But the fact is that the policies of the Chicago Police Department and the welcoming city ordinance in Chicago, which, by the way, has a loophole big enough that you can drive a truck through it, in terms of its lack of interaction with federal law enforcement or federal immigration enforcement agencies, that is the least of them. That is the least of them, as opposed to all of the problems within the Chicago Police Department, and we have seen over decades, that is the least of them. And for these things to be pointed out continuously creates a kind of atmosphere and environment for people which is really dangerous. And there is simply no evidence that these policies in any way treat this or in any way add to a lack of public safety. I want to just close in some ways where I began, which is in this notion that we are about to, as I say, celebrate Thanksgiving and think about this story. And you know, we have gone through these periods before where there has been this idea that immigration and immigration policies somehow held us back as a country. But what those stories tell each and every one of us is that, number one, immigration has always been an economic engine of progress, but it's always been an engine of social progress. That diversity in our country has always made us better in the arts and in culture and in music and in all the other ways, in politics and in all the other ways that we can be. And so as we go into this season, I hope that all of you not only will have a wonderful time with your family, but that I hope that when you or if you hear anywhere around the table or elsewhere some reference to a sanctuary city, that you will just do the first thing that's the easiest thing and simply point out there is no such thing. Because if we can't discuss this issue in a factual way, we are never going to get to the larger debate that we need to have over immigration policy and really fixing immigration in this country. And that's a simple place that we can all start and frankly restore adherence to federal law. Thank you very much. You want to take some questions? Okay. I see a question here.
I have a process question that has 3 parts.
Okay. I'm trying to get out my pen.
Can you make us see how a legitimate judicial warrant comes about? Like, who starts it? What courts do they go to? Who's involved in it? And then on the other side of that, before all this stuff started, let's say before Trump, what was the normal way that the feds found out that they wanted to have a retainer? And then the third part, which is not directly related, is after 9/11, we heard a lot about, say, names that were mistaken, being subjected to rendition. Can we assume that's no longer going on? What's happening with that?
Okay. So the first, in terms of the process, ICE is a federal agency that works through the federal government in the same way that all agencies do. The other thing to remember is that immigration enforcement is actually a civil matter. It's not a crime. So what happens is that if ICE needs a judicial warrant in order to detain someone or for some other function, they are able to work through the civil branch of their local U.S. Attorney's Office for whatever jurisdiction that they're in, and that U.S. Attorney's Office is able to go to a federal judge and seek the warrant. And those warrants are actually issued with some regularity. And that was and has been, I should say, with a little bit of ebb and flow. That process has been the one that's been in place traditionally, for a number of years. For a period of time through the 80s and into the 90s, these 287G, as they're called, agreements between state and local law enforcement and federal agencies were in place in a number of jurisdictions around the country. And in those cases, the local official simply honored the detainer, absent the kind of warrant that we've been talking about. It's really, and it's a kind of a fascinating thing. There was in Champaign County, for years, the sheriff there honored every request from ICE for a detainer. And about 5 or 6 years ago, a new sheriff got elected, and he was doing that for some period of time, and some immigration rights advocates brought that issue to his attention, and so he sought an opinion from the local state's attorney, and the state's attorney said, you aren't required to honor any of these detainers, and he's never honored another one without a warrant ever since. And so, that one of the things that has been, I think, perilous is that that these detainers became kind of a ritualized, regularized thing, and sometimes it was as subtle and as informal as ICE agents developed a friendship with a particular law enforcement agency or leader, and then that became the process for doing it. I will just say, for all of the talk and the interesting kind of conversation now, in Chicago, that for years there was a particular district commander who was known to have a friendly relationship with an ICE official, and the district was feeding a lot of the information, even when it was not official department policy. So, these kinds of things informally have happened over time. And I would say that in some ways, that's the way a lot of this kind of grew up and became, much more regularized and ritualized than we've seen in the past. In terms of the detentions post 9/11, I think it is fair to say that we are not seeing, that level or kind of, detention and questioning and engagement of people in terms of just by simple misidentification of name. But I think one of the things that we're seeing, and I mentioned this a little bit, but I think one of the things that we're seeing, which is almost as frightening in its own way, is that someone goes into a regular meeting they have with ICE. They're out of status. They may have a standing deportation order against them from years before. They go in and for a regular meeting, and they simply don't come home because they're taken into custody right then and there. Despite the fact that they've been attending these meetings, checking in, giving all the information they need to in terms of movement and things for years. And so, you know, I think that's the level of kind of, if you will, it's not really rendition in any way, but I think it's the level of sort of surprise around this that we're seeing that's becoming much more common right now. Yes?
So you going off of that, you mentioned like a restaurateur, the local restaurateur,
yeah,
going to those regular meetings, and criminals know how to hide, but those guys don't. And it's, I guess what my question has to do with, I guess, I don't know a lot about it, I just know that it was a couple months ago, so maybe about 4 months, DACA protections, you know, here's a group of people who have gone, literally signed into a register to try to be honest with the federal government.
Right.
Do you think that that's in danger of being used against them?
I think the danger is there, yes. I think that, and I'll say this, I think that, as all of you know, or as many of you will know, President Obama began the Deferred Action Program after Congress failed to act on the DREAM Act. And deferred action is not a free pass. It is not a path towards citizenship. It is not any of the things that I think many of us would like for people who came here and were brought here through no fault of their own. And the president, he tweeted that he ended DACA, so that's how we know. And he said, well, Congress will act on it. As we were talking about coming in, Congress doesn't seem particularly engaged in terms of acting on it right now. In fact, what Congress ought to do is put a clean DREAMer bill on the end of the year spending bill that they have to pass. Because there ought not be any negotiations over funding for the wall or anything like that as part of it. They said they were going to fix this problem. They ought to just fix this problem if they're going to be really, faithful to what they said. But to the question, these young people have provided information about themselves and their family members to the federal government in exchange for this deferred action. And that was a thing people debated at the time, and there were many people who were eligible who didn't sign up for DACA for that very reason. With this administration, with this kind of standardless approach to who's really dangerous and who's not, I would say that I have a greater fear that information will be used against those individuals' parents than even the DACA recipients themselves if as people start falling off the program in March of 2018. My fear would be that the administration would make a judgment, which is a political one, that they don't want to have a bunch of young people who are here be driven out, but they might use the information to go after parents. And in a variety of different settings, the officials from DHS, including the woman whose name I've forgotten, who's up for the position as secretary now that General Kelly has left, have not really given the kind of assurances that I think any of us would want that information will not be used. And so, I think that's a real danger. My own fear is that the danger is much more acute for the parents of the recipients than the recipients themselves. Yes?
I have a question. Being in Lake County, I'm familiar with some veterans groups and don't know how true this is, and it may well be rumor, but I've been told that veterans, Latino veterans, are being questioned about their residency as to whether they were born here, not, and their suspicion is to be deported.
Yeah.
But at the same time, they're allowing Latinos to enlist and not ask the question. So is that?
I don't know, obviously, about the specifics. You know, we've seen, you know, a number of, you know, I would say disturbing anecdotal reports from across the country of people who have served in the country, who've been honored for their service, you know, who have, you know, done the thing that many of us would not do or send our own sons to do, who have ended up then being the subject of deportation activities as the result of, you know, some minor scrap that they have once they return. And so I think, you know, this is one of those moments when I think when those questions come up, you know, people's antennae go way up. And it's really a, you know, again, it's sort of it's a frightening human thing, in that for people. I just, I had this moment, I was reminded of this over the weekend, or over last week, you know, and it goes to this point of, can you imagine what it's like to be the veteran sitting there and being asked those questions? And given all that you see on television and the chants of build the wall and the rapists and the murderer comments and all of that, can you imagine what that moment must feel like and how harrowing it is? And so I was looking last week at something where this is a little bit elongated to get to this, but you know, we were looking at a review of all of our social media activity for the last year, just going from election day to now. And what was amazing was that the day our social media activity was the highest was on a day last spring when there began to develop and circulate these reports in Chicago, because the Department of Homeland Security does a regular process with the police department where they go to CTA stops and they're searching for bombs. It's part of an anti-terrorist thing, and you know there's clear rules. You can walk up to there. They ask people randomly to search your bag. If you don't want to have your bag searched, you just turn around and go to another stop. You don't have to do it. It's not mandatory in any way. People were so frightened because of the language. They were sure that this was a deportation stop and they were rounding up Latinos and Muslim kids and taking them away. And it caused this flurry of activity that, you know, it was almost impossible to shut down. And, you know, we checked with the CPD, we talked to immigration enforcement people, we figured it out, and we were able to put the information out. But, you know, it's that level of fear and anxiety. And, you know, we had people tell us after that in some communities, people just didn't go out and go shopping for a week. And so I think that's the dangerous kind of thing that one sees. Yes?
Exactly along with what your story is. I'm familiar with several food pantries in Lake County. And immediately after the election, the number of people that started coming dropped dramatically. And it was because they were afraid. They were afraid that when they came in for food that they were going to be arrested.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a harrowing thing, and I think it is, and as I said about even the sanctuary city thing, the words have consequences even where they can't change the policy or the law. You had a question.
Yeah, I had a common question on it. As I understand, all the nations of the world have their boundaries, and that they regulate who is able to come into their countries.
Right.
And we have had various immigration laws at different times in history. I think we had a Chinese exclusion law once upon a time. And the U.S. Constitution says Congress has the sole authority over immigration. And of course, they've set up the Immigration Service, of which the enforcement agents, I believe, are federal law enforcement people.
Correct.
And now some of these states have created a wall between sharing information with this immigration agency, but they'll do it with like Homeland Security that you just mentioned, they'll do it with the FBI, they'll do it with all the other agencies, except for that one agency that's involved. Now, any person that wants to come to the United States, and we've had a lot of manufacturing, industrialization, starting in the 1900s, or that'd be the 1890s and so on, where we needed, the employers needed labor from Europe. They came in from basically Europe, in Southern Europe. And we're at a situation now, though, where those manufacturers really don't need those kind of people anymore. They really don't need much in the way of people because they ship them out to other countries. Now, people that have immigrated without going through authority, without applying for a visa or for a work permit or anything like that, they're jumping ahead in the line, ahead of all the other people that are still waiting and have been waiting for 10 or 15 years. So a lot of them that have come into the United States illegally, and of course they had children and so on, but when they came in the United States, they knew they were not supposed to do that. So they were taking a risk that they would be found eventually and that they would have to leave the United States. Maybe the children they had in the United States or brought with them would have to leave the United States. Now those kind of people, in my mind, because they got ahead in the ticket line, if you want to say that, are like cheaters. And I really don't care for cheaters, be it a card game or be it coming into the United States. So why should we be sympathetic with them?
This is a question that we get a lot. And I don't want to pick on anybody locally, but I will. Let's take that out. Let's play that out for cheaters, right? The Boeing Corporation has cheated on federal contracts in the past, but we give them federal contracts again. We don't punish them in that way. We've had other corporations and other people who have done this, but we give them a chance and we say, because it's for the good of the country. The interesting thing in this context is, you're right, Congress has the responsibility to oversee and to maintain the regulations for immigration. And in fact, they should do that. There ought to be regulations. There ought to be tests. No, I don't know, I literally don't know of anybody who disagrees with that. The problem is we've refused to do it for dozens of years. And we haven't, and just let me finish. So it's not criminal, it's a civil law. Well, then they don't want to do that because then you have to give a lawyer to everybody who's going to be deported, and they don't want to do that. But here's the thing. What we have today is a situation where we are allowing, in terms of even just the numeric values of people that we permit in each year, at a level that really is more appropriate for the 1990s, not for the 21st century. We also have a system, as I said before, which tends to divide families, and we have a system in which, we don't allow kind of a full airing of due process and vetting of someone's rights or ability to remain in the country under those regulations because of the way in which this system operates. And the last thing I'll just say is that one of the things that we're seeing is that not even in the context of so-called undocumented workers, but we're actually seeing this administration begin to grind to a halt the ability to bring in people through business visas and other kinds of activities that we've always relied on, beyond just the kind of the industrial circumstance, that has helped, as I say, be kind of an engine of progress in the economy of our country. And so I think that, I'm not opposed to saying, or I'm sorry, I'm not here to suggest that the immigration system would just be perfect if we didn't do so much enforcement. What I think is we need to actually overhaul the entire system. And that ought to be where we put our focus instead of in these paths to enforcement that really don't get us anywhere in terms of where we want to be. Yes, sir.
I was always taught in school that we have a government of laws and not of personalities and men. This sounds like this is shading the other direction. Is it part of a larger thing? Are we moving in that direction in other areas as well?
Well, yes. We are, and I think it's unfortunate. In part, I think there is there's no question that the power, the reach, and the impact of the executive branch has grown mightily over the last 40 or 50 years. I think we can agree on that without question. If Governor Stevenson had become President Stevenson, he would have had far less power than presidents have in the modern age, in many ways. But there is this other reality that the words of a president and their administration, as we were talking about in the circumstance on the CTA, carry with them a weight and a resonance that is outsized of anything, sometimes that's even in law. It creates a circumstance in which these simple kinds of pronouncements about things get fixed in some people's minds as being right or appropriate. Let me, just to give you an example of one thing, I'll confess, I worry about a lot. As you know, given the introduction, I've worked in some ways, even though I said I was not going to, I have worked in some ways around the legal world for 30 years now. I believe in America's system of justice. I really honestly, even when I disagree with a decision from the Supreme Court of the United States, if I look at something like what the Supreme Court did to the Voting Rights Act a few years ago and how awful that is, I still fundamentally believe that those justices believe that and didn't really understand that impact, that there is an inherent balance and fairness in that system. I believe that to my core. What does it mean when a president calls people a so-called judge because they disagree with him? What is the signal that it sends to me when a president declares day after day that his Justice Department ought to investigate and prosecute his political enemies? What does it mean when we start to say that those lines, those normative kinds of things are no longer valid? We have a president who circumvents the entire pardons process to pardon a guy who was found as engaging in racial profiling time and again, who refused to stop, and then he says, but the people loved him. I'm guessing the Latinos didn't love Arpaio so much. And by the way, it seems that the voters of Maricopa County didn't last November either. But I do worry about what happens with these things. I think, in these areas, this is troubling. And when you add on to it these reports that the president meets with individual prosecutors before he nominates them, and it is his absolute right to do it. I don't question that. but it sends a signal about, loyalty that we know has been asked of some people, and what that means. And those things do worry me. And the great thing has been in I think this instance of sanctuary cities, the Sessions DOJ has said, well, this is what the law means, and the courts have told them no, repeatedly and emphatically. How long does that hold up? How long do people understand that that's what it means? I'll just say, we have this problem in many ways, in many ways in other areas. I am always reminded of the fact that even if that around immigration, I used to love when he was on the air, and Bill O'Reilly, who one of my favorite people to watch and someone I frequently disagreed with, used to rail about the fact that he didn't understand the immigration courts process because these people are here without, they don't have any rights. Just read the Bill of Rights. They never use the word citizen. The word citizen never appears in the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. It is always people or persons. And they knew the difference. They knew the difference. And so, but if you say that long enough and loud enough and with that kind of platform, I worry about the degree or the capacity to inform and to enforce that as we go forward, because I think people lose their way. It's a complex world and we're all busy, and I do this for my day job, so I get to think about these things a lot, but I worry about that as we go along. Oh.
Shall we have one more question?
Okay, yes. I can do this forever, so we probably, because nobody likes the sound of their own voice more than me.
Bring it back to what you started out talking about, the trust sanctuary cities. Given that Illinois adopted the Trust Act, is there any reason or advantage to us on a local level going to our local communities, our local villages and counties, and urging them? Is there any need to have them adopt a welcoming city ordinance? I can see a resolution, yeah, it's good, but is there any need to have them adopt an ordinance, or does the Trust Act just cover the whole state?
The Trust Act covers the entire state. I still think there's a need. And the reason I do is for in two ways. The first is that I think that the more local we can drive this discussion, the better served we are. I think that actually does really matter. And the second thing is, and the second reason I think it's important is that there still is this question that gets raised, and I'll say whether it's in Chicago or whether it's in smaller communities, about whether or not an individual officer may know someone and say, oh, you're going to raid here? Yeah, I'll park my car outside. Sending that signal that that's not right at that local level from the people who pay pay the salary of that officer, he or her, I think that's important, and I think it does matter. And I think that for that reason, while there may not feel like the same kind of fierce urgency that there was at one point in time to do it, I think the more that can happen, the better off we are.
I want to thank you so much. For one, I learned a tremendous amount from this. And one of the things that I think we all loved hearing is that words matter, laws matter, and we've been given by you in this last question, I'm so glad we had that last question, something that we can do about it.
Right.
So thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you.